Hello everybody, and welcome to my presentation on value management and design thinking, where I will compare the two approaches and see what are the differences and similarities between the two. So the first thing I want to present is what is design thinking, and then quickly I'll talk about what is value management, then the comparison between the two while we speak about each approach. We'll look at the similarities and differences, and finally a conclusion where I explain what can be added to each method to improve it. Design thinking is, according to the definition of the Interaction Design Foundation, it's a nonlinear, iterative process which seeks to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. So comparing that to value engineering, we see that both of those processes want to understand users, and we eventually want to find solutions that will solve the problems of these users. But in value management, we don't usually do prototypes and tests, but we do something else. So value management, if you look on the right, is concerned with improving and sustaining a desirable balance between the wants and needs of stakeholders. So we're not talking here about users only, but many more people than the users, all the stakeholders. And so we're looking for the balance between the needs of these stakeholders and the resources that are required to satisfy these needs. So the resources can be time, it could be money, it could be weight, it could be a few things that can be involved in the process. And we are trying to balance that with the needs we're going to satisfy with the solutions. So let's look first at design thinking in a bit more details. So design thinking will help tackle ill-defined or unknown problems. So there's a process to understand better the problems. It will allow designers to focus on what's most important for users. And that's also what we do when we do value engineering. When we start the function analysis, we identify the functions that we need to accomplish, and we kind of categorize the functions on what's important and what's nice to have. It helps us think outside the box, and we also want to do that in a value engineering process. It helps us understand and act on rapid changes. By talking directly to the users, we can understand what has changed in their needs. It's a more human-centric manner. We tend to design products like buildings or roads, interchange, bridges, manufacturing processes and things like that. And we don't always put the human in the center of that design in the value engineering, but this design thinking thing really wants to put the human in the middle. It's a disruptive and innovative way of solving problems. They say that they're a new way to think. So let's have a look at the origins of design thinking. As for value engineering, it started after World War II with the chaos that happened at that moment during the Industrial Revolution, and collective problem solving was important. So design thinking started in the 50s, just like value engineering. Nobel Prize laureate Herbert Simon was the first to mention design thinking in his 1969 book. He then went on to contribute many ideas throughout the 70s, which are now regarded as principles of design thinking. And onwards, design thinking started to become a leading innovation methodology. The 5 phases of design thinking are as follows: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. But we can come back whenever we need to if we haven't done everything to our satisfaction. Look at each one. First one is empathize, where you need to research your users' needs. So you listen to the users, you talk with them, you ask them what is the problem, what works well, what works bad. And it's very important to have that empathy, to understand what the problems are, and to set aside your own assumptions to really understand the real insight into users and their own needs. And this is where function analysis starts in our value engineering process. What are the functions that we want to achieve to fulfill the needs? Stage 2 is define, where you state your users' needs and problems in a way that you can use this information. So you accumulate the information during the empathize stage, and now you define it in a way that you can use it for problem solving. You analyze and synthesize all those observations or discussions to define the core problems with your team. And then you eventually define the problem statement in a human-centered manner, putting the human in the middle of the problem and try to solve his problem. So this is what FPS and the function tree does. The function tree will help you identify which functions are more important, less important, and the functional performance spec defines what you have identified as needs and performance and so on. Stage 3 is ideate, where you challenge these assumptions and create ideas, where you start to think outside the box. You look for alternate ways to view the problem and identify solutions. So this is the same as the creativity phase in our value engineering process. Stage 4 is prototype, where you identify a most important need and you create a solution, and you identify the best solution that you could satisfy for each of the problems identified. So the problem may have 3, 4, 5 aspects to it. You may prototype all of those or one aspect, and you will produce a number of inexpensive scaled down version of the product to investigate, to see if it really works. So in the value engineering process, what we do instead is the value improvement proposals, where we define what we propose instead of what's happening now, and we prove feasibility, we explain how it's going to be done, but we don't prototype it, we just explain and document what will be done. It has happened a few times when I work with clients in the manufacturing sector that they decided to go right away and try it. And they did small prototypes for one aspect of the problem to see if it really works. Stage 5 is test, where you try your solutions out. So you take your prototype and you go see your users and say, try it, tell us what works well, what doesn't work well, and then you can have iterations to go back and say, well, maybe we didn't understand well, maybe we should try something else, and eventually you have a whole bunch of alternate solutions, and then you choose the best one. So in the value engineering process, this is where we evaluate solutions, look at different solutions, how well they fulfill the needs, maybe build scenarios with some of these solutions, and then eventually do a value graph to identify which scenario or which solution has the best value for the stakeholders. So if we look at value management quickly, we want to define and add measurable value. And in this context, value is described as the ratio between the level of satisfaction of the needs to the cost or the resources required to satisfy those needs. So the more you satisfy needs at the same cost, the more value you get out of a product or a process. So we really want to focus on objectives. So what are the needs that we're trying to satisfy before looking into solutions? And then eventually we look at solutions to identify the cost. But first we want to look on functions. We want to enhance innovation. We want to understand those needs as best as possible so we can find the best solution. Benefits of value management: better decisions based on the needs, not just based on the pleasure of the designers. Improve performance of products and services, increased efficiency, enhance competitiveness, because your product or your process will satisfy the needs more than your competitor. It will help build a value culture within your company. And obviously, there's organizational learning and improved capability to embed change in the design process. So the value approach in 6 steps based on the Institute of Value Management is: first, you have to identify that there's a need for a study, a value study. So somebody out there has needs that are not satisfied, so we can study that and eventually define a solution to fulfill their needs. So there could be a kickoff meeting. Yes, there's a need here and we will take care of it. First thing you do is the function analysis, where you analyze those needs to identify the functions that need to be achieved. And then you look for and you find solutions, and then you compare the solutions and evaluate them to identify which one is the best, which is the one that has the most value for the stakeholders. So we put them in a drawing just like the design thinking process. Don't forget, function analysis is not just let's talk about what your needs are, but it's really let's identify these needs, let's organize those. When we identify the needs, we identify functions. We organize these functions, we characterize the performance required from these functions. We set them into a hierarchy, which means which functions are the most important, the ones that are less important. And then we evaluate the cost of the functions of a product or a process or a building or whatever. For example, this is a function diagram. This is a tool that we use a lot in function analysis. And in this case, for example, we've identified the basic function. This is a bridge plate between a bus and a platform so that people don't fall between the two. They can get off or get on the bus without falling in that gap. So the basic function was to bridge that gap, and we have to do these things. Well, we could decide that we want to and decide then after that what solution we can use, and look at the cost distribution of these this solution that we were looking into. So this is all part of function value engineering, and it's not done like that in design thinking. Design thinking doesn't talk about cost analysis at all. So the creativity phase, same thing. We want to find the most creative and innovative ways to perform the functions. The evaluation phase is where we evaluate these ideas and eliminate the ones that don't make sense, and then keep the ones that are interesting to develop the value proposal. The development phase is where you develop value improvement proposals, where we prove feasibility. We cannot just say, oh, instead of this, do that. We have to prove that it's feasible. There's the pros and cons of this. There's the risk associated to this proposal, and the cost and the savings generated by these proposals, which is something that design thinking doesn't look at. But design thinking will prototype a solution to manage that risk, to see really how it works. So the last thing that we do in the value engineering process is the value graph, where we can compare the different solutions and find the one that has the best value. There's two here that have much more value than the base case. The slope represents the value by comparing the level of satisfaction of the needs over the cost. So these two are very interesting solutions. This one, not too bad. This is the base case, and this one has less value than the base case, so it should be rejected. So design thinking will test solutions instead of doing a value graph. Which is best? It depends on the context. Sometimes you can do a prototype and test it. Sometimes you cannot. So if we compare the two, There's the value management process on top and the design thinking process on the bottom. So we have a need for study and kickoff, which is where we listen to a user and understand that they have problems and they need a solution to solve these problems. We analyze the functions, which is identify, organize, prioritize, characterize, and evaluate the cost of these functions, which is the same as defining. So you talk to your users, you understand their problem, and then you define this problem statement, which is what you're trying to solve. Then in the green, you need to find solutions, which is the same thing as ideate, where you can use brainstorming, brainwriting, you do some research to find solutions to solve the problem that you've analyzed previously. Then you write your value improvement proposals, where you compare the different solutions, and in the design thinking, they do a prototype instead. And eventually you evaluate the solutions and find which one has the best value, and that's in the value management. In the design thinking, you would test them and identify which one has passed the test. So in a design strategy, the middle part here is the value management principles, and then around it is the design thinking. So you start in the left section where you have either an advised client that you're working for or a market research because you want to focus on a certain market. They have needs that are not satisfied, so you do function analysis, and then from that function analysis, you end up with a functional performance specification, which is the steps empathize, where you discuss with either your client or your marketing people, understand what are the user's needs, and then you define the problem based on what you've heard in the empathize stage. Eventually you get to the green ideate stage, which is the same thing as getting a conceptual design. So you have different concepts that you can come up with. And in the value management process, you would do a value study here to make sure that you choose the concept that has the best value. But in the design thinking, they would prototype it and test it to identify which solution has the best result and how you can improve it based on the prototype and the test you do with that prototype. So conclusion, there's a very similar pattern between the value management job plan and design thinking, but it would be possible to add function analysis techniques to design thinking to help them define the problem statement better. And we could also add cost analysis to design thinking, which they don't really do, or they don't talk about it in the design thinking documentation. But one interesting thing is also that we could add prototyping and testing to some value studies. Now, you don't need to prototype the whole product that you're working on, but you could select first a basic function, prototype that first, and then maybe select other functions and prototype that later. So you could do a few prototypes and test them to make sure you're in the right direction. So this is my presentation on design thinking and value management. So if you have any questions and any comments, I will be very happy to answer to these questions now. Thank you very much. I added some bibliography in the following pages that you can refer to.